in a classroom where silence usually meant safety. One boy suddenly found himself at the center of attention he never asked for. He had grown used to being overlooked, his presence fading into the background while others were called upon, praised, but on this day, the rules had changed. For the first time, the teacher who had always ignored him decided to notice him, not to lift him up, but to set him up. It wasn't just a request, it was a trap, a challenge meant to expose him, to remind everyone in that room exactly where she believed he belonged. She pointed to an old piano in the corner, its keys yellowed, its sound nearly forgotten. "Play!" her voice seemed to say without words. The smirks from his classmates, the sharp edge of her gaze, the weight of expectation, it was all pressing down on him at once. What she didn't know was that music wasn't just a skill for him. It was his legacy, a rhythm that ran through his blood, handed down by generations who had played not for applause, but for survival, for dignity, for the right to be heard when no one wanted to listen. In that moment, the boy realized he had a choice. Shrink under the weight of her mockery, or let his talents speak louder than her prejudice. The decision he made next would silence the room and change the way they all saw him forever. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to Hidden Black Stories, where we uncover powerful stories that reveal the struggles, resilience, and hidden triumphs of Black voices across history and everyday life. Now, let's step into the world of Elijah Rivers. Elijah was not the loudest student in his 6th grade classroom at Jefferson Middle School in Little Rock, Arkansas. In fact, he had learned early on that being quiet made life easier. His notebooks were always neat, his assignments finished on time, and his pencil tapped a steady rhythm whenever he was deep in thought. It wasn't nerves, it was habit. A small, steady beat that helped him focus when everything else around him felt uncertain. To most teachers, Elijah was just another face in the crowd. But to Miss Abigail Thornton, his homeroom teacher, he was something else entirely. She wasn't cruel in ways you could point to. She didn't yell, didn't openly insult. Her brand of exclusion was quieter, more calculated. She ignored his raised hand when he knew the answer. She skimmed past his victories but lingered on his rare mistakes. To others, she seemed strict but fair. To Elijah, she was a wall one he could never climb, no matter how hard he tried. His classmates noticed too. Some whispered about it. Others joked. "You got teacher invisibility?" a boy once teased, and Elijah had only shrugged. He had learned to live with being unseen. But being unseen carried its own weight. It taught him to expect less, to take up less space, to doubt whether people like him were ever meant to shine in a room where others set the rules. That's why the shift came as such a shock. One morning, Miss Thornton's gaze lingered on him longer than usual. It wasn't the kind of look that promised praise. It was sharper, searching, as though she'd already decided something in her mind. Elijah felt it, that unsettling anticipation, and later that day, it happened. For the first time in months, she called on him in class. His answer, clear and precise, drew no applause. No smile from her, only a faint nod, as though she was testing him for something greater. Elijah thought little of it, until after the bell rang. That's when she asked him to stay. With the classroom emptying around them, she pressed him about his grandfather. She had overheard him once mentioning that his grandfather had been a musician, a jazz pianist who played with soul and skill that carried through generations. To Elijah, those memories of his grandfather at the piano were sacred, a reminder of something beautiful. But on Miss Thornton's lips, it felt different. She twisted it into something else, an opportunity not to honor, but to humiliate. In that moment, she set the trap. She told him he would play for the class. Not as celebration, but as spectacle. She expected him to falter, to fumble on keys too old and out of tune, to stumble beneath the weight of every watching eye. She wanted to confirm her bias that his worth was small, his talent non-existent, his presence forgettable. Word spread quickly. By the next morning, Elijah walked into a room buzzing with whispers. Students leaned toward each other, asking what he would play, whether he even could play at all. Some smirked, some waited for the embarrassment they were sure was coming. The air grew heavier with every minute, the pressure mounting. Elijah sat quietly at his desk, his pencil tapping slower than usual. He could feel every pair of eyes waiting. He could feel Miss Thornton's smug confidence, Sitting like a weight on the piano in the corner, she believed she had already written the ending of this story. What she didn't know, none of them knew, was that Elijah had been preparing for this moment his entire life. Not to please her, not to prove his classmates wrong, but to honor the legacy of music passed down through his blood. His grandfather's hands had once guided his own, showing him how notes could tell stories, words never could. And now, in this small, tense classroom, Elijah was about to tell a story that no one would forget. The stage was set. The trap had been laid, but the one who would be left speechless was not Elijah. The morning of the performance, Elijah barely touched his breakfast. The usual comfort of warm cornbread and scrambled eggs sat untouched on his plate. His mind was already at school, already hearing the whispers, already feeling the sting of Miss Thornton's eyes on him. She had turned a classroom into a stage, and him into a pawn. When he arrived, the energy was unmistakable. Students who had never spoken to him before glanced his way with smirks, nudges, and hushed laughter. A few leaned close, whispering predictions about his failure. It wasn't just about music anymore. This was about proving a point, his teacher's point, that no matter what he tried, he would always fall short. Elijah slipped into his seat, his pencil tapping a nervous rhythm against his notebook. The sound soothed him, reminded him of late nights when his grandfather's piano filled the house with jazz so deep it felt like a heartbeat. But in that classroom, the rhythm was drowned out by judgment. Every glance, every smirk was a reminder that they weren't waiting for music, they were waiting for humiliation. The lesson dragged. Miss Thornton taught with her usual authority, but her focus kept drifting toward Elijah. She knew the moment was coming, and so did he. The tension wrapped itself around him, each minute stretching into an eternity. Finally, the clock's hands crept toward the moment she had planned. With deliberate calm, Miss Thornton closed her book. The room quieted, as though everyone already knew what was about to happen. Her eyes locked on Elisha. Now, her posture seemed to declare, "Let's see if you're really worth all that talk." The piano sat in the corner, a relic of better days. Its wood was scratched, its keys slightly yellowed. To the others, it was an instrument. To Elisha, it was a test. The silence in the room grew sharp as he stood, each step toward the piano echoing louder than it should have. Laughter rippled from the back of the room, muffled but cruel, and Miss Thornton watched with satisfaction. When Elijah sat down, the weight of the moment pressed against him. He knew what this was. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't encouragement. It was a setup crafted to remind him of his place. She didn't believe he could play. Not really. She wanted to strip him down in front of his peers, to use his own family's legacy as a weapon against him. The air shifted. Some students leaned forward, their eyes filled with hunger for spectacle. Others looked away, already cringing for what they assumed was about to unfold. Elijah's hands hovered above the keys. For a moment, he felt the fear pressing down hard, almost enough to break him. But then something deeper stirred. Memories of his grandfather's lessons came rushing back, how he would place Elijah's small hands on the keys, guiding them gently, telling him that music was more than sound. It was strength. It was survival. It was the voice of people who had been silenced and underestimated for generations. That memory burned brighter than the humiliation waiting for him. Elijah exhaled. His fingers brushed the ivory, feeling their worn edges. They were stiff, imperfect, just like the expectations set against him. But he also knew that even broken instruments could carry truth if played with enough heart. The first notes rose, fragile but steady. A blues progression one. His grandfather had played on sticky Arkansas afternoons when the world felt heavy and the music cut through the weight. The sound filled the room, soft at first, then stronger. The whispers died. The smirks froze. Even Miss Thornton's smug expression shifted, ever so slightly. She had expected a stumble, maybe a painful attempt at Mary Had a Little Lamb. But what she was hearing was different. It was confidence. It was skill. It was art. Elijah didn't look at her. He didn't look at anyone. The classroom disappeared, replaced by memory and melody. His hands moved with grace, weaving through chords and runs his grandfather had taught him, each note carrying not just practice, but passion. And as the sound grew, so did the tension. What started as an attempt to mock him was transforming into something else entirely. The trap was back. The very setup meant to humiliate him was becoming his stage 2 rise above it. Every student could feel it. The laughter had turned to silence. The silence to all. And Miss Thornton, who had orchestrated the moment, was no longer in control of it. The power in the room was shifting, note by note, from her to him. Elijah pressed harder into the keys, each chord ringing with defiance, each melody carrying the weight of generations who had been underestimated and ignored. He wasn't just playing the piano. He was telling a story and forcing everyone to listen. And for the first time, they did. The first chords rang out with a trembling edge, but Elijah leaned into them, letting the sound swell, steadying his heartbeat with every note. His left hand kept the rhythm strong and unwavering, while his right hand lifted the melody higher, stretching it like a thread, pulling every ear in the room closer. What began as cautious notes became a force, a current sweeping the class into silence. The students sat frozen. The boy who had always faded into the background was suddenly commanding the air itself. Each key seemed to unlock something hidden, something raw and undeniable. What Miss Thornton had expected to be a stumbling spectacle was turning into a performance that pulled power away from her and placed it directly in his hands. Elijah's mind shifted to the afternoons when his grandfather's piano filled their small home. He remembered the way sunlight spilled across the keys, the way stories were told through sound rather than words. His grandfather used to say that every note carried a piece of history of struggle, of hope, of pride that could never be erased. And now, Elijah carried that same weight, pouring it into a classroom where his worth had always been questioned. He pushed the music harder. His fingers flew across the keys and patterns. His classmates couldn't follow, a blend of discipline and soul that belonged to something bigger than him. The piano, though aged and imperfect, bent beneath his touch, offering a sound fuller than anyone expected. Notes cascaded, harmonies collided and resolved, creating a tension so thick it left the room breathless. The smirks that had once curled on lips were gone. Brandon, who had teased him earlier, now leaned forward, arms no longer crossed but loose, his mouth parted as though caught off guard. Madison, who usually watched the clock, was transfixed, eyes wide with reluctant admiration. Tyler's face glowed with pride, his expression saying everything Elijah didn't have words for, and Miss Thornton, her carefully composed mask was cracking. Her eyes narrowed, her lips pressed thin, but her posture betrayed her. She was listening. She was shaken. She had prepared for a moment of triumph, a lesson delivered at Elijah's expense. Instead, the lesson was being written in sound, and she could not control it. The music swelled, building toward something bigger. Elijah let go of fear, let go of the room, and surrendered fully to the story and the keys. He shifted into a sequence his grandfather had called the climb, a progression of runs that soared upward, each note layering on the next until it felt like the piano itself was reaching for the ceiling. The energy pulsed, undeniable, and every student in the room felt it. When he struck the crescendo, it was like a declaration. The chords thundered against the walls, reverberating into the quiet corners of the classroom where his voice had never been heard. He pressed harder, letting the last run carry everything. His frustration, his silence, his determination, his legacy. Each note fell like a hammer, each pause like a breath that dared anyone to doubt him again. And then stillness. The final note hung in the air, vibrating through the old wood of the piano, before fading into silence. Elijah let his hands fall to his lap. He didn't move. He didn't look at anyone. He let the weight of what had just happened fill the room. No one laughed. No one whispered. The silence was heavier than any insult, thicker than any judgment. It was the silence of awe, of disbelief, of a truth too powerful to ignore. Then, from the back of the room, a single clap broke through. Another followed. Within moments, the room erupted in applause. Students who had never looked at him twice were now clapping, some even cheering, their voices rising in astonishment. Tyler whistled low, shaking his head as though he couldn't believe his own ears. Even Brandon muttered under his breath, "Man, I didn't know he had that in him." But Elijah didn't smile. He didn't play for their applause. He had played to reclaim something that had been denied to him, not just attention, but respect. And he could feel that respect now, rippling through the room in ways that words never could. Miss Thornton remained still. Her arms crossed tightly, her expression unreadable. She hadn't clapped. She hadn't moved. Her silence stood apart from the rest of the room, sharp and deliberate. But it didn't matter anymore. The power she once held over him had slipped away, carried off in the notes he had played. For the first time, Elijah wasn't invisible. For the first time, the classroom belonged to him. And as he sat there, calm and steady, he realized the truth. His teacher's trap had failed. She had tried to turn his heritage into a weakness. Instead, it had become his strength. The story she meant to write for him had been rewritten by his own hands. The climax had passed, but the impact was only beginning. The sound of applause faded slowly, like a tide receding after a storm. Yet the energy it left behind lingered, heavy and undeniable. The classmates who once waited for Elijah to stumble were now staring at him with wide eyes, whispering in disbelief. The ones who had laughed before were silent, unable to dismiss what they had just witnessed. But in the midst of all the noise, Miss Thornton's silence was the loudest of all. She remained still, her lips pressed tight, her arms folded in defiance. The authority she once wielded so effortlessly now looked fragile, almost cracked. She hadn't expected this outcome. She hadn't expected to be proven wrong so thoroughly in front of her own students. Elijah rose from the piano bench, calm and steady. He didn't need their applause, didn't need her approval. The music had already spoken louder than anything he could say. And as he walked back to his desk, the weight he had carried all year, the weight of invisibility, of being overlooked and underestimated, seemed to fall away. The lesson resumed, but the classroom wasn't the same. When the bell rang, the chatter erupted again. Backpacks zipped, chairs scraped, but the conversations were different now. I didn't know he could play like that, someone whispered. That was insane, another said. Tyler clapped him on the back as they walked out together, grinning with pride. Even Brandon, who had mocked him the day before, avoided eye contact, no longer able to dismiss him. But Miss Thornton wasn't finished. At the door, she called his name. Elijah paused, turning back. For a moment, her face softened, as though she might say something rely acknowledgement, maybe even an apology. But then the mask returned. Her voice was clipped, controlled. Remember, this is still my classroom. Elijah held her gaze, calm and steady. I know, he said, and then walked out. He didn't need to argue. The truth had already been spoken in every note he played. That afternoon, as he walked home through the familiar streets of Little Rock, the air felt lighter. The weight he had carried for so long had lifted, replaced by something else. Pride. At the corner store, Mr. Hinson, the shopkeeper, gave him a curious look. You look like a boy who just did something important. Elijah only smiled. Maybe he had at home. The smell of fried catfish and cornbread filled the kitchen. His mother hummed softly as she cooked, her voice carrying warmth and familiarity. When Elijah sat down at the table, she looked at him closely, noticing the quiet confidence in his posture. Long day? She asked. He nodded, then told her. Everything the challenge. The whispers, the music, the silence that followed. She listened without interrupting, her eyes shifting between concern, pride, and something else, something softer, almost sad. When he finished, she reached across the table, squeezing his hand. Sounds like you made her uncomfortable, she said. I think I did. And how do you feel about that? Elijah didn't hesitate. Like it was supposed to happen, her smile was small but knowing. Good. The next day at school, things weren't entirely different, but the shift was undeniable. Students who had never spoken to him before stopped at his lunch table, asking how long he had been playing, telling him how amazing it was. Tyler sat proudly beside him, repeating to anyone who would listen, told you he had it in him. Madison, once skeptical, admitted she had been wrong. Even Brandon, though unwilling to say much, no longer carried the same smirk. And Miss Thornton? She carried on, as though nothing had happened. teaching her lessons with the same tone and posture as always. But the room felt different now. Students glanced at her differently. The invisible wall of authority she had built had cracks in it. Elijah had not only challenged her assumptions, he had exposed them. As days turned into weeks, Elijah felt something he hadn't felt before. Visibility. People saw him now, not just as a quiet boy in the back row, but as someone with depth, with talent, with a story worth hearing. And while Miss Thornton might never admit what she had tried to do, Elijah no longer needed her validation. His music had already told the truth. Because sometimes the most powerful resistance isn't loud or confrontational. Sometimes it's letting your talents speak louder than the doubts. Letting your truth resonate so strongly that even those who try to silence you cannot ignore it. Elijah had proven something to his classmates, to his teacher, and most importantly, to himself. That he was more than their assumptions, more than their silence, more than their prejudice. And once you claim that kind of power, no one can take it away. So the question remains not just for Elijah, but for us all. When faced with doubt, with dismissal, with prejudice, what will we do? Will we shrink back, or will we rise? Letting our gifts speak louder than the voices that try to diminish us? Elijah's answer was clear. He played, and in playing, he made sure they had no choice but to listen. And maybe that's a lesson for every one of us.